Conservative leader that talks about the hardship Canadians are facing, that talks about the problem of inflation. Over 25% of the inflation that Canadians have been subjected to over the last while have to do with outsized price increases by corporations. Corporate greed is playing an important role in the inflation that Canadians are experiencing, but that is nowhere in the analysis of the corporate-controlled Conservatives. I'd like to hear the Conservative leader talk about the role of corporate greed in inflation and what he would propose to do about it.
He seems to be suggesting that corporations were not greedy 8 years ago because food prices were much lower then. But that suddenly now, maybe it's something in the water, that the level of greed in the country has grown dramatically over the last 8 years, and that this is the sudden cause of food price increases. Well, reality is that big corporations always do well in an inflationary environment.
So this idea that corporate greed is to blame for inflation is just not very credible. Of course, corporations are greedy. Everybody's perfectly greedy. Everybody wants a higher wage for themselves and less cost. But firms can't just set prices unilaterally, or rather they can, but what really determines price is supply and demand, because firms want to set their price at the market clearing price. So what happens is you've got a demand curve and a supply curve, and at some point they intersect. And the point where they intersect is the market clearing price, the price where the quantity supplied by the market is equal to the quantity demanded by consumers. Now, if you try to sell above this price, then you'll just be undercut by your competitors. You can sell below it, but there's no reason to, because if you sell at it, you're gonna sell out your whole stock anyway. In the words of Milton Friedman, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena, in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. Actually, that's not even correct. You can have inflation with a stable price level, because inflation is really just an increase in the money supply. So in an economy with a fixed money supply, where every year let's just say, $100 billion in the economy, no more or no less. In this economy with a fixed money supply, every year you would see prices slowly decreasing because production would be increasing, presumably due to savings and reinvestment and capital accumulation. And this increase in production would lead to an increase in the supply of goods and slightly lower prices. But because the government's always creating money out of thin air, prices are always going up.
Very simple. Why? If you have stuff, then you get richer when stuff goes up in price.
Now, assuming he's talking about increases in inflation, there's no reason for that to be true. Which isn't to say that it couldn't be, but it's certainly not guaranteed. So, inflation is going to make asset prices increase, as it makes all prices increase. But the real value of a good should stay the same. That is the real price, the price adjusted for inflation. Now, inflation can fuel price increases in assets. It's possible. For example, if you look at what's been happening in Canada over the last decade, or maybe longer, but certainly over the last decade, we've seen basically inflation was concentrated in the real estate sector. So why does this happen? Well, the way that inflation works is the money doesn't just get like if the money supply was doubled, it wouldn't necessarily mean the prices of everything were doubled equally. So what happens is the newly created money uh, is created, and then it gets spent. It gets spent by the person who created it. So in this case, the banking system and the political class. It gets spent there, and then it sort of oozes its way out into the economy, raising prices as it goes. So it depends on how the money gets spent to determine which prices increase the most and which prices increase the least. This is called Cantillon effects, named after the French economist Richard Cantillon, who brilliant author. His essay on the nature of the economy, commerce in general, brilliant work, very prescient, um, and who is responsible for identifying the critical role that entrepreneurship plays in the market economy in terms of allocating scarce resources. So what happened in Canada was that a lot of this newly created money was going towards purchasing homes because a lot of people were purchasing homes. So as the newly created money was paid out in salaries, people were buying homes with them. So that's why we had uh, such phenomenal or unusual growth in the price of homes and sort of like stable price levels elsewhere is because that's what people were spending the newly created money on. And then what happened was eventually the prices just got too high that people can afford to buy new homes anymore or enough. So they started spending their money on other stuff like food, and that's why food inflation was so high, may continue to be so high in the coming years. We'll see. But main thing is I disagree with this idea that um, somebody with assets is going to have their situation improved by inflation. No, what will they're shielded against it. It just doesn't affect them, but it doesn't benefit them. So who benefits from inflation? Well, the person creating the money, they certainly benefit. Um, but also debtors benefit. People who have debts because they end up paying back their debt with money that is worth less. Also, the people that get to spend the money first benefit because they're able to spend it at the old pre-inflation levels.
If you need stuff, you get poorer when stuff goes up in price. That's why inflation.
So that also is not really true. Inflation is quite literally a tax on people who have savings, or that's who uh, inflation hurts. So inflation is caused by monetary expansion. In particular, it's caused by the central bank creating money out of thin air and lending it to the government. That's what central banks have been doing for 400 years now. So that money goes to the government spends it, they pay salaries, they do a bunch of stuff with it. But although the money was created out of thin air, it's being used to purchase real goods and services. So you can't get something for nothing. So those goods and services come at the expense of somebody else, and that somebody else is anybody who has money, cash savings, cash in their pocket, bank accounts, etc. Anybody who's holding cash, uh, inflation is they're basically taking some of that cash. That's why it's actually correct to call it a tax because it's the government taking that person's money. or the value of their money, or a portion thereof. And I think this might be difficult to understand or to grasp, maybe not, but I think it'd be helpful to imagine an economy, sort of an isolated economy of 100 people, sort of rudimentary economy. They're all stranded like on an island someplace, pretty big island, but no contact with the outside world. So basically, they would all produce and trade. One guy might fish, another guy might forage, a third might um, chop wood or fetch driftwood, a fourth might stitch clothes together or create clothes somehow, etc. So people would produce and they would trade. Now, let's say they had money in this scenario. Let's say they had U.S. dollars because they were all American. They were on a plane. It crashed there. So they've got a money supply of $30,000, which is all the cash that everybody had with them. And that's a fixed money supply. There's nobody creating any more. We'll say, for the sake of argument, that none of the money gets destroyed or whatever. So they have a fixed $30,000 money supply and an economy, okay? So all the goods that everybody would produce would have a price. Let's say a fish is like $3, and a coconut is like $2. Now, money is just a medium of exchange. So when people are trading with each other, um, well, they're selling their products for money, right? So the fisherman would sell his fish for money. The coconut gatherer would sell his coconuts for money, and then they use the money to buy whatever production they want. But what they're really doing is trading production. But money allows you to do it in sort of a roundabout way, where you can sell to anybody and buy from anybody. You don't have the double coincidence of wants. Okay, so let's say one of the survivors finds like a hidden stash, a briefcase with $20,000 on it. Okay, and he doesn't tell anybody about it. And what he does is he just starts using that cash to buy stuff. Okay, so this would basically be the same thing as him counterfeiting $20,000. So he finds $20,000, and he can use that money to buy fish, to buy coconuts, but he's not actually trading anything in return. He's not producing anything and trading, which is normally how you would go about getting some money in this economy. If you don't have it, you would have to produce something and sell it, and then you would get that money and you could buy stuff. But this guy, because he just found that $20,000, that people had missed in a briefcase, he can hide it, he can spend it, and he can get, the coconuts and the fish. Everybody else is doing work, and he's just spending this money he found or he created. He didn't create it, but that's how it is in the banking system. They create the money. In the government banking system. So this guy, he's getting all the fish and the coconuts and the clothes and everything. But that's real wealth. And so it doesn't come out of nowhere. So if he gets that, it's at the expense of somebody else. And who's that somebody else? It's anybody who had money. That's the somebody else that he's basically stolen the value of their money by counterfeiting. So that's what inflation is. Inflation is the government printing money and stealing the wealth of anybody who saved cash. Maybe they're saving to buy a car or a house, or maybe they just like to save money for who knows what.
Always a tax on the poorest people to the benefit of a tiny minority on top.
The benefit does generally go to the elite. First of all, what organization is the largest debtor in any given economy? It's the government, okay? But also, a lot of corporations and a lot of very rich people are heavily in debt. Okay, Donald Trump famously owes billions of dollars, right? Because they have assets that they can pledge to cover that money. Because corporations are going to pledge their assets to get, hundred millions of dollars of loans, so that they can invest in capital, etc. And and so the people who benefit from inflation primarily are debtors, because the debt that they incurred becomes worth less, uh, because of inflation. So if you owe $10,000 and there's 5% inflation, you make $500 basically. But it doesn't. It's not really the poor that are harmed, or the working poor, um, since presumably their salaries are going to increase because of the inflation. It's a cost like anything else. So if prices are going up, it's a price like anything else. So if prices are going up, eventually their wages are going to go up too. There might be a transition period when it's lagging, depending, but I just don't think Pierre's analysis is accurate here.
It's not just those who sell stuff, but it's those who own assets that get better off. So that's why I warned in this House of Commons in the fall of 2020 that printing $600 billion of money was going to lead the billionaire class to become extremely wealthy. And it did. You're pumping $400 billion into financial markets, inflating financial assets, and enriching the people who own those assets, who are overwhelmingly...
No, I do want to walk that back a bit here, because because if what he's saying is true, that they're pumping the money through the financial system, and then it goes to the assets, right? Then that would drive up the price. But it depends. I mean, if what's happening is the Bank of Canada is just creating the money and then lending it to the federal government, and then it's being spent by the political class, then I don't see that driving up the asset prices. I think ultimately it would depend on the technical details of how exactly the new money's created and what happens to it.
Affluent and well-to-do people. And in the process, you are diluting the wages of working class people. Inflationary costs are borne disproportionately by the poor and the disadvantaged. You're effectively transferring an enormous sum of wealth to those who have financial assets while diluting the wages of working class people. Are you not
But transferring from whom?
Worried that this is going to expand the gap between rich and poor? The gap between rich and poor has grown. I knew this would happen, because when you funnel hundreds of billions of dollars into the financial system, you balloon the assets of the people who have, and you increase the costs on those who have not. Inflation is the most immoral tax. It takes from the have-nots to give to the have-yachts. Conservatives will not only get rid of the carbon tax on food, we will get rid of the inflation tax on everybody.
So inflation is absolutely an extremely destructive phenomenon, and the way to eliminate it is to have a stable money supply. I mean, the other thing is, like, it would be pretty difficult to eliminate inflation, because you'd basically have to return to a gold standard, or legalize competing currencies, or adopt like a Bitcoin standard, and you would also have to change the way that banking is done, because banks create money out of thin air and lend it out. That's inflationary. That's actually what caused the Great Depression, was bank credit expansion through private banks. So the whole thing's a mess, but I do 100% agree with Pollieve's oh, how do you say his name? So I agree 100% with Pollieve that that inflation's really bad. Inflation has to be stopped. But I disagree with a bit of his analysis of how it works and why it's bad. I don't think inflation disproportionately hurts the poor per se. Um, I think it hurts savers who often are like more middle class or like lower middle class.